My name is Rebecca Chen, I'm 32 years old, and I walked into my parents' house that evening knowing it might be the last time I'd do it on their terms. I'd driven the 45 minutes from downtown with my partner Alex sitting quietly in the passenger seat, both of us running through the mental checklist we'd prepared in therapy. Remember, Alex had said as we pulled into the driveway, you don't have to defend yourself. You don't have to explain. You're allowed to just exist. I squeezed their hand and nodded, but my heart was already racing. The emotional trigger hadn't even been pulled yet, and I could feel my body preparing for impact, shoulders tense, jaw tight, that familiar knot forming in my stomach that I'd carried around for most of my adult life whenever family gatherings loomed on the calendar. The front door was unlocked, as always, because my mother believed locked doors meant you didn't trust family. I'd tried explaining boundaries to her once, how a locked door wasn't about trust but about autonomy and respect, and she'd cried for 2 hours about how I was calling her a bad mother. That's how things worked in the Chen household. Any attempt at setting limits became evidence of your cruelty, your ingratitude, your fundamental wrongness. Alex and I stepped into the foyer, and immediately I smelled at me mother's famous beef stew, the one she made exactly 3 times a year for special occasions. My stomach dropped. This wasn't going to be a casual dinner. This was an orchestrated event, complete with comfort food meant to trigger nostalgia and make me remember better times when I was easier to control. Rebecca! You're here. My mother appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her smile just a fraction too bright. I'm an architect. I spend my days reading blueprints and understanding structural integrity, and I'd learned to read my mother's faces the same way. This smile had cracks in it, stress fractures that told me she'd been planning this dinner for days, probably weeks. "Hi, Mom," I said, accepting her hug while trying not to stiffen. Alex stepped forward, extending their hand politely. "Mrs. Chen, thank you so much for having us." My mother's eyes flickered over Alex with that look I'd seen before, polite on the surface, but underneath, a calculation happening. Alex wasn't Chinese, wasn't from our community, wasn't someone she could easily categorize or control, which made them automatically suspect in her worldview. My father emerged from his study, reading glasses still perched on his nose, and I felt that old childhood response kick in, the desperate need for his approval, the hope that maybe this time he'd see me as competent and capable instead of the perpetual child who needed guidance. "Rebecca," he said, "not Dad's little girl or sweetheart, just my name delivered like a status report." "You're late." We said 6:30. I glanced at my watch. 6:33. 3 minutes. In the Chen family, 3 minutes late was evidence of disrespect, lack of discipline, proof that I was still making poor choices. "Traffic was heavier than expected," I said neutrally, already exhausted, and we hadn't even sat down yet. Alex touched my lower back gently, a silent reminder that I didn't need to over-explain or apologize for being human. My older brother Jason was already at the dining table, scrolling through his phone with that air of boredom he'd perfected over the years. Jason was the golden child, Harvard MBA, director at a tech company, married to someone our parents had pre-approved, 2 kids who were already enrolled in the right preschools. He barely looked up when we entered. "Hey Becca," he mumbled, then went back to his screen. I'd spent years resenting Jason for having it easier, for fitting the mold our parents had cast before we were even born. But therapy had helped me see that his compliance came at a cost, to just chosen to pay it differently than I had. The family dinner humiliation I was about to experience was something Jason avoided by never stepping out of line, never questioning, never choosing anything our parents hadn't already approved. As we took our seats, Alex next to me, across from Jason, with Mom and Dad anchoring each end of the table like bookends, I noticed the extra place settings. "Is someone else coming?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual even though alarm bells were ringing in my head. Mom's smile widened. "Oh, I invited Auntie Lynn and Uncle David. They should be here any minute. They've been so worried about you, and I thought it would be nice for everyone to catch up." My chest tightened. Auntie Lynn was my mother's sister, and the 2 of them together were a formidable force of judgment disguised as concern. This wasn't just a family dinner. This was an intervention, complete with reinforcements and witnesses who would pressure me into compliance through sheer numbers and family pressure at dinner, tactics I'd experienced my whole life. Alex leaned close and whispered, "Do you want to leave?" And God, I loved them for asking, for being willing to walk out with me right then and spare me whatever was coming. But I shook my head slightly. I'd spent 8 months preparing for this moment, understanding that the only way to break free from toxic family dynamics was to stop running from them and start standing firm within them. I'd learned about emotional abuse in families, about how controlling parents operate, about how public humiliation only works if you accept the premise that you've done something wrong. I wasn't that person anymore, the one who shrunk and apologized and twisted myself into shapes that pleased everyone except me. Tonight was going to be different. The doorbell rang and my mother practically leaped up to answer it, her excitement palpable. I heard Auntie Lynn's voice in the foyer, that particular pitch that always preceded unsolicited advice and thinly veiled criticism. Uncle David's deeper tones followed, and then they were in the dining room, Auntie Lynn already zeroing in on me with eyes that swept from my casual blazer to my short haircut to Alex sitting beside me. "Rebecca!" she exclaimed, as if she hadn't seen me in years instead of 3 months. "You look so different. Have you been eating enough? You look thin. And your hair, when did you cut it so short?" Within 30 seconds, Shed managed to comment on my appearance, imply I wasn't taking care of myself, and subtly criticize my personal choices. It was impressive, really, the efficiency of family control when it's been practiced for generations. I smiled and said nothing, just watched as they took their seats and the real dinner the one I'd been preparing for finally began. Mom started serving the beef stew with exaggerated care, ladling generous portions into everyone's bowls while keeping up a steady stream of commentary. "Rebecca, I made extra vegetables the way you like them. Remember how you used to help me chop carrots when you were little? You were always such a good helper." The nostalgia was being weaponized already, painting a picture of an obedient child had somehow lost her way. Auntie Lynn nodded approvingly, accepting her bowl with both hands in that traditional gesture of respect that I knew would soon be contrasted against my supposed lack of manners. "Your mother told me she spent all afternoon cooking," Auntie Lynn said, looking directly at me. "She wanted everything to be perfect for you. That's real love, Rebecca. A mother who still cooks for her grown daughter." The guilt was being layered on before I'd even picked up my spoon. Alex thanked my mother genuinely for the food, and I watched her face do that thing where she acknowledged the politeness but dismissed the person behind it. "Of course, Alex. We're just so glad Rebecca finally brought someone to meet the family properly." There was that word again, properly, like every other relationship I'd had was somehow illegitimate because it hadn't survived the gauntlet of Chin family approval. My father cleared his throat, the universal signal that the real conversation was about to start. "Rebecca, your mother and I have been discussing your situation. We're concerned." I felt Alex stiffen slightly beside me, their hand finding mine under the table. I'd warned them this was coming, but hearing it actually begin still sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. "What situation?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral, not defensive. Mom set down the ladle and folded her hands, her expression shifting into what I'd learned to recognize as her wounded mother face. "Don't play games, Rebecca. You know exactly what we're talking about. This whole thing with your job, leaving the firm after we helped you get that position, moving into that expensive apartment downtown, making all these dramatic changes without consulting anyone who actually cares about you." The way she said cares about you made it sound like a threat and a promise simultaneously. Jason finally looked up from his phone, apparently his cue to join the performance. "Yeah, Becca, it does seem pretty impulsive. You had a solid career track at Morrison Associates. Partners were noticing you. And now you're throwing it all away to work at some startup that, let's be real, probably won't even exist in 2 years." Uncle David leaned forward, his voice taking on that patronizing tone that men of his generation had perfected. "Your brother makes a good point. I've been in business for 35 years, and I've seen 1,000 startups fail. You're 32 years old, you should be thinking about stability, about building towards something secure, not chasing dreams that don't pay the bills." The irony of receiving financial advice from a man who'd borrowed money from my parents twice in the last decade wasn't lost on me, but pointing that out would only prove their point that I was disrespectful and ungrateful. Auntie Lynn jumped in seamlessly, the tag team approach in full effect. And what about marriage, Rebecca? You're not getting any younger. When I was your age, I already had 2 children. Your mother worries about you constantly. There it was, the full assault of family control disguised as concern. They weren't trying to dominate me, they were just worried. They weren't trying to run my life, they just wanted what was best for me. They weren't being manipulative, they were being loving parents and concerned relatives who'd gathered for a simple family dinner that somehow turned into a referendum on every choice I'd made in the past year. I took a bite of the beef stew, buying myself a moment to breathe, to remember what Dr. Morrison had taught me about recognizing these patterns. I appreciate your concern, I said carefully, but I've actually thought through these decisions quite thoroughly. The startup has solid funding, I've reviewed their financials, and the work aligns much better with my actual interests in sustainable architecture. My father's eyebrows went up, that look of surprise he got whenever I demonstrated competence he hadn't anticipated. But he recovered quickly. You reviewed their financials? Rebecca, you're an architect, not a business analyst. What do you really know about evaluating a company's financial stability? The constant undermining of my intelligence, my capability, my judgment. This was the foundation of emotional abuse in families. No matter what I did, how much I prepared, how thoughtful my decisions were, there would always be a reason why I wasn't qualified to make my own choices. Mom's voice took on that trembling quality that had made me cave 1,000 times before. We're not trying to attack you, sweetheart. We're trying to protect you. You've always been so naive, so trusting. Remember that boyfriend in college who took advantage of you? Remember when you wanted to study art and we had to convince you to be practical? That boyfriend didn't take advantage of me, Mom. We broke up because you called him 3 times a day telling him I wasn't ready for a serious relationship. The words came out before I could stop them, and I watched her face crumple like I'd physically struck her. Jason shifted uncomfortably. Didn't talk about the family's interference in my relationships, that was an unspoken rule. Auntie Lynn gasped audibly. Rebecca! How can you speak to your mother like that? After everything she's sacrificed for you? And there it was, the ultimate trump card in the Chin family playbook: sacrifice. My mother had given up her nursing career to raise us, had devoted her entire life to our well-being, had made herself small so we could grow. Therefore, we owed her not just gratitude, not just respect, but complete compliance with her vision of how our lives should unfold. Alex spoke up, their voice calm but firm. I don't think Rebecca meant any disrespect. She's just trying to explain that she's an adult who's capable of making her own decisions. My father's eyes narrowed at Alex, and I saw the calculation happening. This outsider was emboldening me, giving me ideas, turning me against my family. With all due respect, Alex, you haven't known Rebecca very long. You don't understand our family dynamics, the history we have, the way we communicate. The dismissal was complete. Alex's perspective didn't matter because they weren't blood, weren't Chinese, weren't part of the complicated web of obligation and guilt that bound the Chin family together. Uncle David nodded in agreement. In Chinese families, we have different values. We believe in honoring our parents, in making decisions that benefit the whole family, not just ourselves. I felt that old familiar shame creeping in, the sense that wanting autonomy made me a bad Chinese daughter, that setting boundaries meant I was rejecting my culture instead of just rejecting dysfunction. But I'd done enough work to understand that toxic family dynamics exist across all cultures, and my ethnicity didn't obligate me to accept emotional manipulation. I do honor you, I said quietly, looking at my parents. But honoring you doesn't mean giving you veto power over my life. My mother's eyes filled with tears, real ones, I think, because she genuinely couldn't understand why the control tactics that had always worked were suddenly failing. You've changed so much, she whispered. Ever since you started seeing that therapist, you've become so cold, so distant. You used to tell me everything. Now you shut me out and make me feel like the enemy. The rewriting of history was masterful. I hadn't used to tell her everything. She'd demanded access to every detail of my life, had called me selfish when I wanted privacy, had shown up at my old apartment unannounced to check on me when I didn't respond to texts fast enough. But in her narrative, my boundary setting was emotional abandonment, my therapy was brainwashing, and my growth was evidence that I'd become a worse person. Jason cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the emotion at the table. Look, maybe we should all just calm down and enjoy dinner. Mom went to a lot of trouble. This isn't about dinner. Mom's voice rose, startling everyone. This is about our daughter throwing her life away and refusing to listen to anyone who actually loves her. The mask had slipped just slightly, revealing the anger underneath the concern, the control underneath the care. Auntie Lynn reached across the table and grabbed my hand, her grip tight enough to hurt. Rebecca, listen to me. I'm going to be very honest with you because someone needs to tell you the truth. Her voice had that edge of righteous authority that family members use when they're about to say something cruel and call it love. You're making a fool of yourself. Everyone in our community is talking about you, how you quit your good job, how you're living with this person. She gestured vaguely at Alex without actually looking at them. How you've stopped coming to church, how you've cut your hair short and dress like you don't care what anyone thinks anymore. The public humiliation was starting in earnest now, my reputation in the Chinese community being held up as evidence of my failures, my choices being presented as embarrassments to the entire family. My father nodded slowly, his disappointment palpable in the air between us. Your aunt is right, Rebecca. Do you know what Pastor Wong asked me last Sunday? He asked if you were going through some kind of crisis, because apparently you haven't been to service in over 4 months. I had to stand there and make excuses for my own daughter. The shame he'd felt was now being transferred to me, as if his discomfort at having to explain my absence was my responsibility to manage. Uncle David chimed in, his voice heavy with the weight of masculine authority. When I see my friends at the golf club, they ask about you. They remember when you were this sweet, accomplished young woman. Now I don't know what to tell them. That you've decided to throw away everything your parents worked for? That you're chasing some fantasy about finding yourself at 32? Mom stood up again, her hands shaking as she gripped the back of her chair. I carried you for 9 months. I was in labor for 18 hours. I gave up my career, my dreams, my entire life to raise you and your brother. And this is how you repay me? By embarrassing our family, by making choices that bring shame to the Chin name, by choosing strangers over your own blood? The tears were flowing freely now, and I could see Jason shifting uncomfortably, probably wishing he was anywhere else but also relieved that for once, he wasn't the one in the hot seat. Auntie Lynn handed Mom a tissue, her own face arranged in an expression of shared maternal suffering. You're breaking your mother's heart, Rebecca. Can't you see that? Every choice you make that goes against what she wants for you is like a knife in her chest. The reality was being systematically rewritten in front of Alex, every witness at this table being recruited to agree that I was the problem. Not the family system that demanded complete conformity, not the parents who couldn't see me as a separate person with my own dreams and needs, not the community that measured worth by traditional milestones and conventional success. No, I was the selfish daughter who'd betrayed everyone who'd ever loved her. Jason finally spoke up, and I could hear the rehearsed quality in his words. She'd been briefed on his role beforehand. Becca, I know you think you're being independent, but from where I'm sitting, it looks more like you're running away. From responsibility, from family, from the life you built. And I gotta say, it's been hard on all of us watching you self-destruct. Self-destruct. That was the word they'd landed on, apparently. Not growing or evolving or making different choices, but self-destructing. Because in their worldview, any path that diverged from their plan was inherently destructive. Alex's hand tightened around mine under the table, and I could feel their barely contained anger at watching my family dismantle me piece by piece in front of an audience. Rebecca isn't self-destructing, Alex said, their voice steady but cold. She's actually thriving. She loves her new job, she's working on projects that matter to her, my father cut them off with a raised hand. Please, Alex. I appreciate that you care about Rebecca, but you've been in her life for what, 6 months? We've known her for 32 years. We know her patterns, her weaknesses, her tendency to make impulsive decisions and then regret them later. Uncle David leaned back in his chair, assuming the pose of a man about to deliver uncomfortable wisdom. Let me tell you something about life, Rebecca. Freedom sounds great when you're young and idealistic. But you know what freedom actually is? It's being unemployed at 40 because you chased your passions instead of building a stable career. It's being alone because you pushed away everyone who tried to help you. It's looking back at your life and realizing you made all the wrong choices because you were too proud to listen to people who had more experience than you. The fear-mongering was textbook: paint a picture of a terrible future, imply it's inevitable if I don't comply, make me so afraid of making mistakes that I freeze and default back to their control. Auntie Lynn dabbed at her own eyes now, caught up in the emotional performance. Your mother calls me every week crying about you. Every single week. She can't sleep, she's losing weight, she's constantly worried that you're going to end up hurt or alone or destroyed by these terrible decisions you're making. Is that what you want? To torture the woman who gave you life? The guilt was being weaponized at maximum intensity now, my mother's suffering presented as my direct responsibility, as if her inability to let me live my own life was somehow my fault. I looked around the table at all these face-me parents, my brother, my aunt and uncle, and I realized they all genuinely believed they were helping me. They couldn't see how their concern was actually control, how their love came with conditions that required me to surrender my autonomy. My mother sat back down, her whole body radiating wounded dignity. I think we need to talk about some concrete things here, Rebecca. Real consequences of your choices that you don't seem to be considering. My stomach clenched. Here comes the ultimatum, I thought. Your father and I have been discussing this, and we've decided that if you continue down this path, we can't keep enabling your mistakes. That means no more safety net. No more coming to us when things fall apart, which they will. No more family gatherings where you bring your lifestyle choices and make everyone uncomfortable. You need to decide what's more important to you, your family, or this fantasy life you're trying to build. The silence at the table was deafening. They were asking me to choose, but really, they were telling me there was only one acceptable choice. Come back in line, accept their authority, submit to their control, or lose my family entirely. I took a slow breath and set down my spoon, the clink of metal against ceramic surprisingly loud in the heavy silence that had settled over the dining room. Something shifted inside me in that moment, not anger, not hurt, but a strange kind of clarity I'd never experienced before. I looked at my mother's tear-stained face, at my father's stern expression, at Auntie Lynn's righteous indignation, at Uncle David's patronizing concern, at Jason's uncomfortable avoidance of eye contact. And instead of feeling the usual panic, the desperate need to fix things, to make everyone happy, to apologize my way back into their good graces, I just observed. I watched them the way an architect studies a building's foundation, looking for the cracks, understanding the structural weaknesses that had been there all along but I'd been too close to see clearly. My mother was waiting for me to crumble, I could tell. She'd pulled out every weapon in her arsenal: tears, guilt, shame, threats, appeals to family loyalty, predictions of disaster. This was the moment where I was supposed to break down, to say I was sorry, to promise I'd reconsider everything, to ask for their forgiveness and guidance. I'd played that role so many times before, knew all the lines by heart. But Dr. Morrison's voice echoed in my head from our last session: Rebecca, when they're performing for an audience, the worst thing you can do is give them the reaction they're scripting. Sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. So I sat there, my face neutral, my breathing steady, and I just watched them wait for me to fall apart. Alex's thumb traced small circles on the back of my hand under the table, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone in this. Auntie Lynn broke first, uncomfortable with my silence. Rebecca? Did you hear what your mother said? She's giving you a choice here. Don't you have anything to say? I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw something I'd never noticed before. She was scared. They were all scared. Not for me, but of me, or rather, of what I represented. I was the first person in our family system to say this isn't working for me anymore, and if I succeeded in breaking free, what did that mean for all of them? If I could choose a different path and be happy, then what excuse did they have for staying trapped in their own patterns of control and resentment? My silence was threatening because it refused to engage with their narrative, refused to accept the premise that I owed them an explanation or a defense. I picked up my water glass and took a sip, taking my time, letting the moment stretch out. I could see my father's jaw tightening with frustration was used to commanding attention, to having his words land with weight and authority. My continued calm was throwing off their entire strategy. Jason cleared his throat awkwardly. Becca, seriously, you're kind of freaking everyone out right now. Can you just say something? I turned to look at my brother, this man I'd grown up with, shared a childhood with, and I realized I barely knew him as an adult. Had disappeared into the role of perfect son so completely that I didn't know what he actually thought about anything beyond what our parents approved of. What would you like me to say, Jason? I asked quietly, genuinely curious. He blinked, clearly not expecting the question to be turned back on him. I don't know, just acknowledge what Mom and Dad are saying? Show that you're listening? Give us some indication that you actually care about how this is affecting the family? And there it was, the expectation that my caring would be measured by my compliance, that love meant absorbing their anxiety and making myself smaller so they could feel more comfortable. I nodded slowly, taking in his words, filing them away mentally alongside everything else that had been said tonight. I was documenting it all, every manipulation tactic, every guilt trip, every threat disguised as concern. Not because I wanted ammunition for some future argument, but because I needed to trust my own perception of reality. Toxic family dynamics survive by making you doubt yourself, by convincing you that your memory is faulty and your feelings are unreasonable. Uncle David slammed his hand on the table, making the dishes rattle. This is ridiculous. Show some respect. Your parents are talking to you. His anger was revealing. When control tactics don't work, controllers often escalate to intimidation. But I'd seen this pattern before, studied it in therapy, understood that his outburst wasn't really about respect at all. It was about fear of losing the power dynamic that had always existed in our family, where the elders spoke and the younger generation obeyed without question. I turned my gaze to him, still calm, still observing, and I saw him falter slightly under my steady regard. He wasn't used to being looked at this way, with clear eyes that saw through the performance to the insecurity underneath. My mother's voice came out small and broken. Rebecca, please. You're scaring me. Why won't you talk to us? And I felt a twist of something in my chest, not guilt exactly, but a kind of sadness. Because I knew that in her mind, she genuinely was scared. She'd built her entire identity around being my mother, around guiding and shaping and controlling my life, and my independence felt like a rejection of her entire existence. But I also knew, with painful clarity, that her fear was not my responsibility to manage. I couldn't set myself on fire to keep her warm. I couldn't sacrifice my own well-being to maintain her comfort. Dr. Morrison had been very clear about this. You can have compassion for their pain without taking responsibility for fixing it. Alex leaned close and whispered, "You okay?" I nodded slightly, and I meant it. I was okay. More than okay, actually. For the first time in 32 years, sitting at this table surrounded by people who claimed to love me while actively trying to control me, I felt a strange sense of peace. The silent observation I was practicing wasn't passive, it was powerful. By refusing to engage with their script, by staying calm and centered while they escalated around me, I was demonstrating something crucial: they couldn't make me perform anymore. The family drama, the emotional abuse in families, the public humiliation at dinner, none of it had the power over me that it used to have. Because I'd finally understood that their approval wasn't worth the price of my authenticity, and their love, conditional as it was, couldn't fill the hole that came from abandoning myself. While my mother dabbed at her eyes and my father stared at me with increasing frustration, I made a decision that none of them could see happening. It wasn't dramatic or loud, wasn't announced or defended, it was quiet and internal and absolute. I decided that this dinner, this performance, this desperate attempt to guilt me back into compliance, would be the last time I allowed them to treat me this way. Not because I was cutting them off forever or declaring some dramatic estrangement, but because I was drawing a line that I'd never drawn before. I would no longer participate in family gatherings where my life choices were put on trial. I would no longer accept phone calls that were thinly veiled interrogations. I would no longer shrink myself to fit into their narrow definition of who I should be. The decision settled into my bones like something that had always belonged there, just waiting for me to claim it. I reached into my jacket pocket slowly, my fingers closing around my phone. Alex noticed the movement and gave me a questioning look, but I just gave them a small smile. During one of our therapy sessions, Dr. Morrison had suggested I document moments like these not for proof or validation from others, but so I could look back later when doubt crept in and remember exactly what had happened. Gaslighting works because it makes you question your own memory, Shed said. Having a record helps you trust yourself. So while Uncle David launched into another lecture about responsibility and Auntie Lynn added her commentary about community reputation, I quietly opened my voice memo app and set my phone face down on my lap. The red recording light blinked steadily, capturing every word, every manipulation, every threat disguised as concern. My mother noticed me looking down and misinterpreted it as shame or submission, her voice taking on that soothing quality she used when she thought she was winning. "Sweetheart, I know this is hard to hear. I know you think we're being unfair. But someday you'll understand that everything we're doing tonight is because we love you." I nodded slightly, not in agreement but in acknowledgement that she'd spoken, and I watched her face brighten with hope. She thought my silence meant surrender, thought my calm demeanor meant I was finally seeing reason. She had no idea that internally, I was preparing a message I'd send later not to her, but to Dr. Morrison, summarizing this evening and using it as evidence of exactly the patterns we'd been working to identify and interrupt. Jason leaned back in his chair, apparently satisfied that the intervention was working. "See, Becca? We're not trying to control you. We just want you to think carefully about your choices. Is that really so unreasonable?" I looked at my brother and wondered what his life was like behind the facade of perfect compliance. Did he ever lie awake at night wondering what his own dreams might have been if he hadn't spent his entire life fulfilling our parents' expectations? Did he resent me for attempting the escape he'd never had the courage to try? Or had he genuinely internalized their values so completely that he couldn't even see the cage anymore? I wanted to ask him, wanted to reach across the table and shake him and say, "Jason, when was the last time you made a decision that Mom and Dad disapproved of? When was the last time you did anything just because you wanted to?" But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I mentally composed the email I'd write to my therapist tomorrow, outlining the specific manipulation tactics used tonight: the weaponized tears, the appeals to cultural obligation, the recruitment of extended family as witnesses, the threats of abandonment dressed up as consequences, the constant undermining of my judgment and capability. Dr. Morrison had helped me create what she called a manipulation bingo card, a list of common control tactics that toxic family members use. Tonight's dinner was hitting almost every square. The documentation I was gathering wasn't about building a case against my family or proving them wrong. It was about maintaining my grip on reality in the face of people who desperately needed me to doubt myself. My father cleared his throat again, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Rebecca, your silence is childish and disrespectful. We've all taken time out of our busy schedules to be here tonight because we care about you. The least you can do is engage with us like an adult." The irony of him calling my silence childish while simultaneously treating me like a teenager who needed parental permission to make life choices wasn't lost on me. I took another sip of water, buying myself another moment, and in that moment I made another quiet decision. I would prepare a document for myself, a kind of declaration of independence that I'd keep private but refer back to whenever I felt myself wavering. It would list my boundaries clearly, my non-negotiables, my lines in the sand. Not for them they'd never see it but for me, so I'd have something concrete to hold on to. Auntie Lynn was growing increasingly agitated with my continued composure. "This is exactly what I was talking about. This coldness, this distance, it's not natural, Rebecca. You've been brainwashed by that therapist to think your family is the enemy. Can't you see how manipulative that is? The projection was almost funny, accusing my therapist of manipulation while actively trying to manipulate me, claiming therapy was making me cold while they spent an entire evening attacking my character and choices. I thought about the folder on my laptop at home labeled Boundaries Self-Care, filled with articles about narcissistic family systems, about enmeshment, about the difference between healthy family connection and toxic obligation. I'd been doing my homework, educating myself, building a framework for understanding what had felt wrong my entire life, but I'd never had words for. Alex squeezed my hand 3 times, our signal for I love you, I'm here, you're not crazy. I squeezed back twice, thank you, I'm okay. This silent communication was more real, more loving, more supportive than anything happening at this table full of people who shared my blood but didn't really know me at all. I mentally drafted the text message I'd sent to my friend Maya after we left tonight, the one who'd escaped her own controlling family years ago and had been coaching me through this process. You were right, I'd tell her. They can't handle someone who won't play their game anymore. But I'm okay. I'm actually okay. And the revelation that I could sit through this storm and remain centered, remain clear, remain committed to my own truth, that was the real decision being made tonight, the one none of them could see but would change everything. I set my water glass down with deliberate precision and finally spoke, my voice steady and calm in a way that seemed to catch everyone off guard. I need to say something, and I'd appreciate it if everyone could listen without interrupting. My mother's face lit up with relief finally, the apology she'd been waiting for, the breakdown, the surrender. My father leaned forward slightly, ready to accept my capitulation and offer his wisdom about how to fix my life. But what came out of my mouth wasn't what any of them expected. I love you all. I'm grateful for the sacrifices you've made and the support you've given me over the years. But I'm not going to defend my choices anymore, and I'm not going to accept being treated like a child who can't be trusted with her own life. The temperature in the room shifted immediately, confusion replacing their confident expectation of victory. Auntie Lynn opened her mouth to interrupt, but I held up a gentle hand. Please, let me finish. You asked me to talk, so I'm talking. She closed her mouth, startled by the quiet authority in my voice. I've listened to everything you've said tonight. I've heard your concerns, your fears, your disappointment. I understand that my choices make you uncomfortable, and I'm sorry for that discomfort, but I'm not sorry for my choices. My mother's eyes widened, and I watched her trying to process this new version of me, this daughter who wasn't crumbling or arguing but simply stating facts. The thing is, I've realized that you're asking me to choose between living authentically and having your approval. And I can't keep choosing your approval at the expense of my own well-being anymore. Uncle David started to say something about respect and obligation, but my father actually shushed him, something I'd never seen before. Dad was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between surprise and what might have been the smallest flicker of recognition. I continued, my hands steady on the table. I want to be clear about something. I'm not rejecting you, I'm not abandoning the family, and I'm not trying to hurt anyone. But I am establishing boundaries that I should have set a long time ago. I pulled up my phone and placed it on the table, the voice memo app still recording, the timer showing 23 minutes and counting. I've documented this entire conversation because I need to be able to trust my own memory. Because too many times in my life, I've been told that things didn't happen the way I remember them happening. The shock on their faces was almost comical. Jason actually leaned forward to look at the phone, his expression somewhere between horrified and impressed. You're recording us? What the hell, Becca? I met his eyes calmly. Yes, I am. Because gaslighting is a real thing, and I'm not going to let myself be convinced anymore that my perception of these interactions is wrong. Auntie Lynn gasped like I'd committed some unforgivable sin. Gaslighting? You think your own family is gaslighting you? This is insane. But I noticed her eyes darting to the phone, probably mentally reviewing everything she'd said in the last half hour. The power dynamic had shifted so suddenly they were all struggling to adjust, to figure out how to respond when their usual tactics weren't working and their words were being preserved as evidence. My mother's voice came out shaky, uncertain. "Rebecca, I don't understand what's happening right now. We invited you here for a family dinner, and you're acting like we're criminals interrogating you." I softened slightly, because despite everything, I could see genuine confusion in her face. "Mom, you invited me here to pressure me into changing my life choices. You gathered witnesses, made my favorite meal to trigger nostalgia, and spent an hour telling me I'm making mistakes and embarrassing the family. That's not a dinner, that's an intervention. And I'm calmly telling you that it's not going to work." The clarity of my words seemed to cut through the emotional fog, laying bare what everyone at the table had known but couldn't acknowledge. This whole evening had been orchestrated to break me down and bring me back in line. Alex spoke up then, their voice strong and clear. "I think what Rebecca is trying to say is that she's done accepting the premise that she owes all of you control over her life in exchange for your love." My father's attention snapped to Alex, and I could see the anger building in his face. "You need to stay out of this. This is a family matter." But I shook my head. "No, Dad. Alex is my family too. They're my partner, and they have every right to be part of this conversation, especially since you've spent the evening insulting them and dismissing their relationship with me." The boldness of claiming Alex as family, of elevating our chosen relationship to the same status as blood ties, was perhaps the biggest power reversal of all. I was redefining what family meant, refusing to accept that biology automatically granted unlimited access and authority. Uncle David stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I don't have to sit here and be disrespected by some child who thinks she knows better than everyone else." His face was red, his voice loud, and I realized this was what happened when people lost the control they'd always taken for granted. They got angry, they got loud, they tried intimidation as a last resort. But I didn't flinch. I just looked at him steadily and said, "You're welcome to leave if this conversation is too uncomfortable for you. But I'm going to finish what I need to say." The fact that I didn't back down, didn't apologize, didn't try to soothe his anger, that was the moment he realized he had no power over me anymore. He sat back down heavily, looking to my father for backup that didn't come. I took a breath and delivered the part I'd been rehearsing in my head for weeks. "Going forward, I'm happy to have a relationship with all of you, but it's going to look different. I won't be attending family gatherings where my life is put on trial. I won't be accepting phone calls that are really just attempts to change my mind about my choices. I won't be discussing my finances, my career, or my relationship unless I choose to volunteer that information. And if those boundaries aren't respected, it'll take space until they are." My mother made a sound like I'd physically wounded her, but I pressed on. "This isn't punishment, and it's not revenge. This is me finally taking care of myself the way I should have been doing all along. I hope you can understand that, but even if you can't, these boundaries aren't negotiable anymore." The silence that followed my declaration was so complete I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway, each second marking the death of the old dynamic and the birth of something entirely new. My mother's face had gone pale, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. "You can't be serious," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're our daughter. You can't just set rules for how we're allowed to talk to you." But I could see in her eyes that she knew something fundamental had shifted, that the daughter who used to absorb guilt like a sponge and apologize for existing had been replaced by someone she didn't recognize. The loss of control was written all over her face, and for the first time in my life, I didn't rush to comfort her through her discomfort. Jason was staring at me like I'd grown a second head, his phone forgotten on the table. "Becca, do you realize what you're doing? You're basically saying you're going to cut us off unless we do exactly what you want. How is that any different from what you're accusing us of?" The cognitive dissonance in his question would have been funny if it wasn't so sad. He genuinely couldn't see the difference between me setting boundaries for my own well-being and them trying to control every aspect of my life. "It's different, Jason, because I'm not telling any of you how to live. I'm just saying you can't dictate how I live anymore. You're still free to make whatever choices you want, and I'm free to decide what kind of relationship I'm willing to have based on those choices. Auntie Lynn stood up abruptly, her chair nearly toppling backward. I will not sit here and listen to this disrespect. Your mother is right, you've changed, and not for the better. You've become selfish, ungrateful, and frankly, I'm embarrassed to be related to you right now. She grabbed her purse with shaking hands, looking at my mother with something like pity. I'm so sorry, sister. I know this must be devastating for you. But before she could storm out dramatically, I said quietly, thank you for coming tonight, Auntie Lynn. I hope someday you'll understand that self-care isn't the same thing as selfishness. She froze in the doorway, turned back to glare at me, but whatever she saw in my calm, resolved expression made her think better of continuing the fight. She left, Uncle David following behind her with one last disappointed shake of his head. My father finally found his voice, and it came out harder and colder than I'd ever heard it. If you walk out that door with these boundaries intact, don't expect us to be here when you inevitably realize you've made a mistake. There are consequences to choosing pride over family, Rebecca. The threat was clear, the ultimatum laid bare. But instead of the fear and panic such words would have inspired even a year ago, I felt something closer to sadness mixed with relief. I understand, Dad. And am willing to accept those consequences. Because the alternative, continuing to live according to your script, isn't actually living at all. Alex stood up beside me, their solidarity a physical presence that reminded me I wasn't alone in this, that choosing myself didn't mean choosing isolation. My mother broke down completely then, her sobs echoing through the dining room. How can you do this to me? After everything I've given up for you? After all the nights I stayed awake worrying about you, all the sacrifices I made? Jason moved to comfort her, shooting me a look that was equal parts anger and something that might have been envy. I hope you're happy, Becca. Look what you've done to her. But I'd learned enough in therapy to recognize this final manipulation for what it was, the martyr routine, the breakdown designed to make me feel so guilty that I'd cave and take back everything I'd said. Dr. Morrison had warned me this would happen, had told me that when boundaries are set with people who benefit from you having none, they'll make you out to be the villain in their story. I walked over to my mother, and she looked up at me with hope in her eyes, hope that I was coming to apologize, to take it all back, to be her little girl again. Instead, I knelt down beside her chair and spoke gently but firmly. Mom, I know this is painful. I know it's not what you wanted or expected. But your pain doesn't obligate me to set myself on fire to keep you warm. I can have compassion for how hard this is for you while still maintaining boundaries that protect my mental health. She recoiled like I'd slapped her, and I saw the moment she truly realized she'd lost the power she'd always had over me. You're not my daughter anymore, she said, her voice venomous through the tears. My daughter would never treat me like this. The disowning threat, the nuclear option, but even that didn't have the power it once would have. I stood up slowly, feeling Alex's presence behind me like an anchor. If that's your choice, I'll respect it. But the door will always be open if you decide you want a relationship with the real me instead of the version you tried to create. I picked up my phone from the table, stopped the recording, 38 minutes of documentation that I'd probably never need to listen to again but would always have as proof that my reality was valid. Jason was watching the whole scene with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was that the smallest flicker of admiration in his eyes, or just shock? My father remained seated, his face a mask of controlled anger, but I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. The family control that had governed every interaction for 3 decades had been publicly dismantled, and everyone in that room knew it. As Alex and I walked toward the front door, my mother called out one last time. You'll regret this, Rebecca. You'll come crawling back when your little fantasy life falls apart, and don't expect us to welcome you with open arms. The words were meant to wound, to plant seeds of doubt that would grow in the weeks and months ahead. But I turned back and looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw not the powerful matriarch who'd controlled my life for so long, but a scared woman who'd built her entire identity around managing other people and didn't know who she was without that control. I hope I don't regret it, Mom. But even if I do, that will be my mistake to make and learn from. That's what adults do. The final lesson was being taught, not through words but through action. I was claiming my adulthood whether they granted it or not. Alex and I walked to the car in silence, the cool November air hitting my face like a baptism into a new life. My hands were shaking now, not from fear or regret, but from the adrenaline of finally standing up for myself after 32 years of compliance. As I slid into the passenger seat, I realized I was smiling, actually smiling, despite the chaos we'd just left behind. Alex started the engine but didn't pull away immediately. "Are you okay?" they asked, their voice full of concern and pride in equal measure. I nodded, surprised to find that I meant it completely. "I'm more than okay. I'm free." And it was true. The weight I'd been carrying my entire life, the constant anxiety about disappointing my family, the exhausting performance of being someone I wasn't, all of it had been left behind in that dining room. The silent strategy I'd employed during that dinner, the calm observation, the refusal to engage with their script, the documentation of their tactics had been more powerful than any argument I could have mounted. By staying centered and refusing to get pulled into the emotional chaos they were creating, I'd demonstrated something crucial: they couldn't control me anymore unless I gave them that power. The family revenge stories I'd read online always talked about dramatic confrontations and cutting words, but the real revenge, I'd learned, was simply refusing to play the game. It was choosing peace over proving a point, choosing authenticity over approval, choosing myself over the version of me they needed to maintain their control. That quiet defiance was more threatening to their system than any amount of anger or rebellion could have been. As we drove away from my childhood home, possibly for the last time, I thought about all the family dinners I'd sat through where I'd absorbed their criticism, internalized their doubt, and apologized for taking up space. I thought about the years I'd spent believing something was fundamentally wrong with me because I didn't fit their mold, didn't want what they wanted for me, couldn't make myself small enough to satisfy their need for control. The emotional abuse in families works because it's gradual, normalized, disguised as love and concern until you can't remember what healthy relationships even look like. But therapy had given me new eyes, and once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Once you understand that love shouldn't require you to betray yourself, you can't go back to accepting conditional affection as real connection. Alex reached over and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you." I know that was incredibly hard. I squeezed back, grateful beyond words for their presence, their support, their unwavering belief that I deserved better than what I'd been accepting. "The hardest part," I said slowly, "was realizing that they genuinely believe they're the victims in this situation. They really think I'm being cruel and ungrateful. They can't see how their care has been suffocating me for decades." That was the tragedy of toxic family dynamics. Everyone was trapped in a system that didn't serve anyone, but those in power couldn't see it because acknowledging it would mean confronting their own behavior. My mother wasn't evil, my father wasn't a monster. They were just people operating from their own wounds and limitations, unable to see their children as separate beings with valid needs and choices. I pulled up my phone and opened my notes app, needing to capture my thoughts while they were still fresh. "What are you writing?" Alex asked, glancing over briefly before returning their eyes to the road. "A letter to myself," I said. "For the moments when I start doubting whether I did the right thing. When the guilt creeps back in and I start wondering if maybe they were right, if maybe I am selfish and ungrateful." I typed quickly, my thumbs moving across the screen. "Remember, silence was strategy, not weakness. You stayed calm not because you didn't care, but because you cared enough about yourself to not get pulled into their chaos. Their control failed not because you fought them, but because you refused to fight at all. You simply stood firm in your truth and let them exhaust themselves against boundaries they couldn't manipulate their way through. The public humiliation they'd attempted had backfired spectacularly because I'd refused to be ashamed. The witnesses they'd gathered, Auntie Lynn and Uncle David, had seen something they hadn't expected: a daughter who was calm, clear, and unshakable in the face of coordinated family pressure at dinner. Even if they all agreed that I was wrong, even if the entire Chen family and Chinese community sided with my parents, it didn't matter anymore because I'd finally understood something fundamental: other people's opinions of my choices, even family's opinions, don't determine my worth or validate my decisions. I was the only one who had to live my life, sleep with my choices, answer to my conscience. Their approval was no longer the currency I needed to function. Alex pulled into our apartment complex, and I looked up at our building, our home, the one I'd chosen, the life I was building on my own terms. "Do you think they'll ever come around?" Alex asked quietly. I considered the question honestly. Maybe. Maybe not. I hope they do, because I'd like to have a relationship with them that's actually healthy. But if they don't, I'll survive. I'll be sad, but I'll survive. That acceptance felt revolutionary, acknowledging that I might lose my family of origin while trusting that I'd be okay anyway. That I'd build my own family from people who loved me without conditions, who celebrated my growth instead of fearing it, who saw boundaries as healthy instead of threatening. The family control that had governed my entire life had been broken, not with violence or drama, but with the quiet strength of a woman who finally decided she was worth fighting for. We walked up to our apartment hand in hand, and as I unlocked the door, I felt something shift in my chest, not the familiar anxiety that usually followed family interactions, but something lighter, more open. Freedom, I realized. This is what freedom feels like. You know what the craziest part is? I said to Alex as we stepped inside. I think Jason saw it. For just a moment, when I was setting those boundaries, I saw something in his face, recognition maybe, or envy. Like he wished he could do the same thing but doesn't know how. Alex nodded thoughtfully. Maybe watching you do it will plant a seed for him. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is model a different way of being, even if we can't save anyone else. That thought gave me comfort that maybe my stand tonight wasn't just for me, but might ripple out in ways I'd never see. The final lesson I'd learned, sitting at that dinner table while my family tried guilt one last time, was this: control fails when witnesses see the truth, but more importantly, control fails when you see the truth and refuse to doubt yourself anymore. The silent power reversal wasn't about defeating them or proving them wrong, it was about reclaiming my own authority over my life, my choices, my story. They could tell their version where I was the ungrateful daughter who abandoned her loving family, and I could hold my truth that I was a woman who chose health over habit, authenticity over approval, freedom over fear. Both narratives could exist simultaneously, and I no longer needed them to validate mine. That was the real victory, not winning their approval, but no longer needing it to feel whole. I was 32 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was finally meeting myself. So here's the question I want to leave you with tonight: how much of your life are you living for someone else's approval? How many decisions have you made or not made because you are afraid of disappointing people who claim to love you but can't seem to love the real you? I'm not asking you to cut off your family or burn bridges or do anything dramatic. I'm asking you to get quiet for a moment and listen to that voice inside you that's been whispering this isn't right for longer than you want to admit. That voice isn't rebellion or selfishness or ingratitude, it's your soul begging you to come home to yourself. And the truth is, you can't negotiate with people who need you to stay small in order for them to feel comfortable. You can't reason someone into respecting boundaries when respecting those boundaries means they lose control over you. What happened at that dinner table changed my life, but not because I finally stood up to my family. It changed my life because I finally stood up for myself. There's a massive difference between those two things. One is about defeating someone else, proving them wrong, winning an argument. The other is about honoring yourself enough to stop abandoning who you are for the sake of keeping peace with people who won't meet you halfway. And I want you to understand something crucial: you don't need permission to set boundaries. You don't need your family to agree that your boundaries are valid. You don't need to justify or explain or defend your right to live authentically. The people who truly love you will adjust. The people who only loved the version of you they could control will resist. And that resistance will tell you everything you need to know. Maybe you're sitting here thinking, but my situation is different, or you don't understand how complicated my family is, or I could never do what you did. And you're right, your situation is different, your family is complicated, and you might handle it completely differently than I did. But the core truth remains the same: you deserve relationships that don't require you to betray yourself. You deserve love that doesn't come with a manual of impossible conditions. You deserve to make choices about your own life without being emotionally punished for those choices. And if the people in your life can't offer you that basic respect, then the question isn't what's wrong with me? The question is, how long am I willing to accept this? Because every day you spend trying to earn conditional love is a day you're not spending building a life that actually fits who you are. I won't lie to you and say it's easy. The weeks after that dinner were some of the hardest of my life. My mother didn't call. My father sent one cold email outlining the financial support they were withdrawing. Jason texted me twice, once to tell me I'd really done it this time, and once, 3 weeks later, to ask if I was okay. The silence from my extended family was deafening, the absence of their presence in my life both liberating and devastating. There were nights I cried, mornings I woke up panicked, moments I almost picked up the phone to apologize for everything just to make the discomfort stop. But Alex was there, my therapist was there, my friend Maya was there, and most importantly, I was there for myself in a way I'd never been before. I held myself through the grief of losing the family I'd wanted while making space for the family I was choosing to build. And here's what I discovered on the other side of that grief: freedom tastes better than approval ever did. Authenticity is more nourishing than acceptance from people who don't actually know you. Living according to your own values is more satisfying than performing for an audience that will never be satisfied anyway. 6 months later, my startup hasn't failed, it's thriving. My relationship with Alex is stronger because it's built on genuine connection rather than desperate need for validation. I sleep better. I breathe easier. I laugh more freely. And occasionally, rarely, I get a text from Jason that says something like, "I've been thinking about what you said," or "How's the new project going?" Small cracks in the wall, tiny signs that may be witnessing someone break free, plant seeds in others who are still trapped. So what are you going to do with this story? Are you going to close this video and go back to performing for people who won't love you unless you stay small? Or are you going to take one small step toward honoring yourself? Maybe it's setting one tiny boundary, maybe it's saying no without apologizing, maybe it's just sitting quietly and acknowledging that something needs to change. You don't have to blow up your life tonight. You don't have to have a dramatic confrontation at the next family dinner. But you do have to start somewhere, because every day you wait is another day you're choosing their comfort over your authenticity. And I promise you, from someone who's been on both sides of that choice, choosing yourself is scary as hell, but it's the only choice that leads to actually living instead of just surviving. If this story resonated with you, if you saw pieces of your own family dynamics reflected in mine, if you felt that recognition in your chest that says someone finally understands, then I need you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because I'm going to keep sharing stories about breaking free from family control, about setting boundaries that stick, about building a life that's actually yours. You're not alone in this. There are thousands of us out here who've walked away from toxic family dynamics and are building something better. And if you're still in it, still struggling, still trying to figure out how to honor yourself without destroying everything, we see you, we've been you, and we're here to remind you that choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's survival. It's the bravest thing you'll ever do. Now go live a life that doesn't require you to apologize for existing. You've got this.